philosophical and introspective and deep, but nevertheless, the triggers for him were to do with demands. But what did work for him was this indirect confrontational approach. And as I said about the young man before, highly categorized stored utterances or scripts, persistently impulsive communications which are offensive or distancing. I remember working with a young man around 10 years ago, and one of the things he used to do to create distance was to swear and use obscenities with people who made himself exposed. So a way of distancing is to use obscenities or language that he knew in a lot of people would trigger distance. Obsessive, anxiety-driven, descriptive or intellectual litanies. Again, the gentleman before, the litanies he used to talk about was Thomas Tank Engine. And he would ask me about what Thomas is doing today. So humanizing the character to some degree and humanizing all the characters in the world of Soda. I don't know if people are familiar with Thomas, but that is how we'd almost have these circular conversations which would never expose self. Type communication or artistic expression, far beyond what the person can express directly or verbally. Yes, that can happen with some people, and I'm included in that remit. My typed and artistic expression almost contradicts the verbal expression, even though I've gained functional speech. What my parents have noted is that, particularly my mother, when she reads some of my posts online, is the emotional introspective nature of my posts, that they don't quite marry up with how I speak. And it says here, provided or not better accounted for by Tourette's, tics, semantic pragmatic disorder. So that's to do with being literal, aphasias and verbal agnoses. That's to do with being meaning deaf. Social emotional agnosia, that's to do with not recognizing body language, facial expression, or tone of voice. Personality or conduct disorders, alexithymia, which is to do with not knowing one's own emotional states, and that has an 80% crossover with autism, and mood or anxiety disorders. So there are many roads to Rome, and people can have these interconnected processing challenges along with EA. But it's finding out, is the core of it EA or something else? And that is just as important. Exposure to uninvited praise or attention provokes immediate avoidance, diversion, or retaliation responses. So with the young man with PDA, he explained very eloquently how it felt when people directly asked him to do something, i.e. a demand. And it was very moving, really. He said it was like needles in his arm. So his nervous system was having a negative response. It's not just someone acting up or playing up. The nervous system itself is having a negative response. It's having a negative chemical, electrical reaction, which causes this painful response. And it's words, but words can be painful, as we all know. By mid-late childhood, these EA responses may have differentiated into strategies of can't do as oneself, by oneself, or for oneself. So praise and attention are tolerated when the person has assumed a role or a character, but not when they are caught off guard or when being themselves. So as you can see here, if the person with EA develops enough strategies in infancy, it could be by the time that they get to secondary school, they have assumed different characters, different roles, and those characters and roles are all to do with self-protection. And as you can see, they're not going to be caught off guard, if not very seldomly, or when being themselves. So actually, it can actually build up a false premise for people around them. So that could include peers and teachers. So it's in many ways, reflectively, it's worth noting at school if there are any changes if it's parents or guardians watching, or teachers or Senko, any distinct changes in the child's character or attitude, idiosyncrasies, the way they talk, the way they speak, are there differences from home life to the life or the presented life they have in different environments? A phase in early childhood where there's no remorse for involuntary avoidance or diversion, retaliation responses. Yes, I can vouch for that. I was very hyperactive at times. I wouldn't like to use the word destructive, but I certainly was affected in such a way by exposure anxiety that sometimes it would cause severe distress responses. But by mid to late childhood puberty, self-directed rage may result from progressive awareness of one's own condition and a desire, but an inability to escape it. So there's a sense of this becoming ego dystonic. So ego dystonic means someone who's got a condition that goes against self. And EA could be seen very much like that. So, for example, someone with OCD and they're chronic, in its chronic state where people have it severely, it is extremely ego dystonic. It disturbs their day, it disturbs their mind with ritualizations and routines. Another example, Tourette's or tic disorders, where the tics become so intense or so invasive or unintentionally so offensive or unintentionally so violent, not that they want to be. And then this kind of war within oneself that actually I'm aware of this condition and it inhibits me from presenting who I really am or a sense of who I am. So avoidance, diversion, retaliation responses or strategies can't do as self, can't do by self, or can't do for self. Significantly interfere with the person's ability to cope with change, transitions, demonstration of academic or learning skills. It's interesting about change and transitions. The young man with PDA struggled with literal transitional changes. So from going from the house to the pavement, from going to the pavement to the cobbles or these stones on the driveway, and then going from the driveway over to the road, and then going from the edge of the road into the car. And it's all to do with direction, because within that point of getting into the car, a demand, in his case, may be met, or some of the exposure may happen. Demonstration of academic or learning skills, ability to function in employment, ability to gain or sustain general friendships, manage healthy parenting, or sustain long-term intimate or sexual relationships. If one thinks about it rather broadly, the antithesis of a friendship relationship that goes into something serious, such as an intimate or sexual relationship, is a sense of self on both sides being aware of one another. So it depends by this point, is it having an effect on the person's life? Is it having an effect on the person's social life? And in extreme cases, relationships and sexual relationships in later life? Because if it's so chronic and the person is constantly being triggered by being made self-aware, you can understand why difficulties would arise in those areas as the person gets older. Involuntary avoidance, diversion, and retaliation responses and depersonalization strategies of can't do as self, do by self, and can't do for self. So dissociation is quite common on the autism spectrum. Particularly, it's common with people with higher levels of language processing challenges. And if people are using a strategy of dissociation, that is detachment from self. So there's this flux between self is there, but I don't want to present it. So one way of getting out of it is to dissociate, not due to direct psychological effects or any substance or any other medication or condition that could not better be accounted for by abuse or by other anxiety, conduct, personality, developmental, attention deficit, dissociative, attachment, mood, or compulsive disorders. So what's happening here? It's trying to get to the root of the underpinning, the origins, the multiple origins of why someone is dissociating. Is it because they have a specific anxiety disorder other than EA, dissociative disorder or attachment or compulsive disorder? Or do they have developmental challenges that cause them to dissociate, or personality types? Of course, these can all be in the mix, but one can take from this that it's about understanding the multifaceted nature of exposure anxiety. So PDA and different personality types. PDA has got a lot more awareness now than it has done, let's say, even 5 years ago. So let's look at PDA and how it overlaps with other things. Those with avoidant, passive-aggressive, narcissistic personality disorder can have PDA as part of these. So those who are schizotypal, who are naturally nonconformists, there's a really good site called P-Types, ptypes.com, and it goes through different personality types, including disordered extremes. People who are schizotypal are idiosyncratic. So in that sense, they are naturally going to be nonconformist, dance to the beat of their own drum, and be very self-directed. Those tending towards antisocial personality disorders are driven by the challenge and risk of commonly avoid the demands of others. So now we're breaking down the different presentations of origins. So if you're not caring much for authority or authority figures or following rules, it may be that the origin of this is to do with being antisocial. Those with obsessive compulsive personality disorder can have PDA because they are too addictively driven by fixations and obsessional interests. There's a real myth around autism that autism is sometimes intrinsically married up with fixations and obsessional interests, but there are certain personality types that adorn that. OCPD, for example, if you look that up, it has about a 30% crossover with Asperger's syndrome in particular. And OCPD, there is a remit of fixation to rules, to be logical, to be literal, and obsessional interests, and can actually, in some positive ways, be receptive to praise, so achievement and praise. Those with dependent personality disorder commonly avoid demands because they fear independence, as they invest in helplessness as a means of monopolizing the carer. So doing as a teacher or other carer instructs runs counter to this, and they lose monopolization control over the primary carer. So this is to do with the quandary or the difficulty around the codependency of people. And if we think about how codependency works, Neither party should be judged because there are psychological underpinnings. It may be news to people, but core beliefs in children go up to the age of 7, and that's how you build up your patterns of thought. So if someone is invested in playing the role of saviour, of martyr, because of fear, because of the outside world, or how they're going to treat their child, that may go into the person's core belief system, the child's core belief system. It happens until the ages of 7. In other words, children developmentally believe what they are told up until that age. So it's internalizing that information into one's reality. So if the person learns to be more disabled than they are, learns to be more helpless than they are, it can cause this sort of cycle of saving and martyrdom versus I'm helpless. And it's quite right. If you lose the kind of martyrdom there, and you break away in a healthy way from the child, it can have a positive effect on both parties. But the person may not realise this, that they are doing this. The parent may not realise this, and I'm not prepared to de-skill parents here. I think it's about care. I think it's about empathy, and I think it's about being non-judgmental, understanding the roads to which this happened, and to help effectively the child, parent, or guardian in the process. Those with gaming or internet addictions will develop PDA due to their unmanaged addictions. Absolutely. I think we're seeing a rise in gaming and internet addictions. It's becoming a worrisome problem that you have them on your tablets, on your phones, on your laptops, on your games consoles, etc. And like any other addiction, it's to do with the chemical activity of the brain. And I can remember around 5 years old, I had a Master System 2 and got very, very addicted and fixated on one game, Sonic the Hedgehog, which I play over and over and over again from beginning to end. And this was becoming a real problem. And when my mother took it away, the console away, I had so entrenched in my addiction that I had withdrawal symptoms. So that was really quite powerful. It's not that I'm putting a substance in my body, but my brain had got used to the chemical addictions and gratification that games implore. So with each level, you get this buzz. It's when games started, they realised that if they put levels in it, on some unconscious level, you're gratifying. So, oh, well done, you've got to the next level, and it creates this loop. And some people are more susceptible than others. So yes, unmanaged addictions can affect presentation. Those with chronic information overload or the associated chronic fight-flight state of exposure anxiety are subject to avoidance, diversion, retaliation responses and may present as PDA. Yes, as I've said, I worked with a young man many years ago with PDA. And one of the things that I noted one day, just to give a concrete and concise example of how it worked, he was in the kitchen one day, and I've used this example many times, and he was struggling to cook. And the reason why he was struggling to cook is because it was a demand. You see, I'm not going to use his real name, but Bob, can you please cook? And it was triggering his nervous system. And the way in which it triggered his nervous system, he would go rigid, he would tick, so he'd make clicking noises, and he would teeter on his feet, almost in a swaying motion. And what I done is you observe and you be objective and you think, what does he like? And he loved Disney, and he's very dramatic and a great storyteller. So I said, in this sort of very camp kind of overly dramatic voice. I imagine myself being a waiter of some sort in Beauty and the Beast, something along those lines. The pan is ready to be tended to. So you're focusing on the object, the context, not the person. And sure enough, he tended to his cooking. And another thing, with the transition into the car, I drawn that character again, and I said the road is ready to be walked on. The car is ready to be sat in. So you're reversing semantics effectively. You're taking the person away as the focal point, and you're using the context, the subject, the objective as the main premise. So it's a very difficult thing to do because we're so used to being in a directly confrontational world, but it does work. And what else are you doing? Well, you're freeing up his nervous system, which cannot be a bad thing. We've got to look at the bigger picture here in terms of autism, in terms of perceptual issues that a person could have along the way, with or without exposure anxiety. So they could struggle with perceiving emotions, faces, objects, places, sounds, motion. And with this, if that is the case, then you build up the profile of the person in understanding, empathic, objective, and person-centered way. I know person-centered sometimes is overused, but if we really think about what person-centered means, it means looking at the totality of the person, with healthily acknowledging very different levels of disability, but not necessarily going down the road of over-defining. See the personhood as well. So it's almost like a balancing act between getting those two elements correct. When we think about different types of human experience, you can have people who are more good at doing, are more good at conscious thinking. And if you can imagine a person who's very focused and analytical, they may struggle to switch their brain off. And if you have a brain that's like that, now I don't, and this is all related to anxiety more in a generalistic sense, you could have a person focusing on the moment of reference, offering grounded and contextual solutions, explaining emotions in a pragmatic way, for example, lists, pictures, if they're visual learners, and linking social behaviour to emotional feelings. Now, that's not saying that the person themselves is devoid of emotion or is lacking empathy. That's not what I'm saying. It's working parallel with the system. And then you can get people who are being, so that it's almost a prime directive in terms of their mode. And living in the moment, and not you. So that is a person that filters in information more pre-attentively. So it's going in, but not on a conscious level. And that is me, I'm afraid. That is a person who so easily falls asleep. A person who, if they sit down, I'm instantly daydreaming. A person who can get fixated on colours, on shimmer, on shine, and can merge with people and objects very, very easily. So focus on the moment is great, but it is about gently bringing conscious thought on track, which is such as changing the tone of one's voice, using gesture, objects of reference, tapping on objects and around the environment. Now, that may sound quite basic, but when we think about getting one's attention, as you've heard this evening, there are different ways of garnering people's attention, stimulating them, or not in some cases. It's about doing the complete opposite. It depends how their systems work, and no system is the same. And this gives you just a small example of if someone is in one camp or another. One could say you're striving for the middle, aren't you? You're striving for a level of balance. But that's very subjective as well, because that's going to mean different things for different people. So what are my tips for working with EA? First is what I've mentioned briefly in that previous slide: work parallel with the system. That means you learn about the system, and don't be scared of failure. Don't be scared of getting it wrong. Just be open-minded about different strategies. Be self-owning so you can stop watching, waiting and wanting. So what that means is you have to have a level of autonomy, and a healthy level of autonomy, and also don't be a helicopter. So because it's not just about your body language, it's about your energy when you come into the room, how you're feeling, what you're expecting. And if the person who may be sensitive to those sort of things picks up on that very quickly, then it's going to create those diversion, retaliation responses. Focus on the object issue, not on the person. So I've given you an example of the young man with PDA. I'll give you another example of a gentleman with Fragile X, autism, and exposure anxiety around food. He would not eat in the home. So I asked one of the staff, what does he like to eat? And it was tangerines or mandarins, I forget which. So what I'd done is I went downstairs, got them, put them on a plate, and it's all about your energy as well. So he's sitting in the room. So it's almost like the thief and the supplier kind of role here. So I happen to go in the room. I happen to put the plate down. I happen to leave. So I'm being self-owning. The next thing I'm doing is focusing on the object, not the issue. He needs to eat. So that's the next layer. There's an element of, small doses. So I'm gently doing this, but at the same time, I'm being self-owning. Playing hard to get. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing as well, because with the small doses, I'm giving that gentleman the time, the patience to build up a friendship, to build up a kinship, to build up a healthy association with eating food. So you always leave the person wanting more. And what that means is once you get this strategy right, you can leave the person wanting more, wanting a connection. Give you another example of that. It's a rather moving one, really, when I think about it. Around 10 years ago, I worked at a specialist school for people on the autism spectrum. And there was a young man that came to that school, and he was around 10 or 11, very young, very small for his age in this school, from 11-year-olds to 19, a massive age gap. And there's all these tall human beings around him, and it must have been incredibly scary. It was a boarding school as well, so this is the first time he's away from his mum, which must have been terrifying. And people were saying he's playing up and he's acting naughty, and he was slamming doors and pulling his pants down, etc. And I was in the room and I thought, well, there's got to be a way of connecting with this young man. And what I did is I sat beside him and didn't speak. And with that, what happened is he started exploring me, my face, my hair. And I wasn't doing anything. This is about bonding, and clearly had some sensory perceptual issues, and he needed to touch to create reality, to associate. and he would pull these big O-like gestures at me, which I would reply in, because it's about understanding his system. And I worked with him in this way for around 2 weeks. And what I'm also giving him is a sense of wanting more. What I'm not doing is triggering diversion, reality, diversion, retaliation, compulsive responses, which I noted other people doing, but that's not their fault either. They weren't understanding what was going on, and that's fine. Because I noticed when he was being asked to do things and was made self-aware, he was screaming, making this high-pitched scream, and would go into echolalic. He was echolalic anyway. And silently, we were building up a sense of bonding. And we were sat down having a break, and I was sat again next to him, but just far enough. And literally, all of a sudden, he said, "I'm going to hug you like mummy now." And he gave me this massive hug. And the woman across the way couldn't believe it. She was a TA. And I think they felt, or at least I got the impression, that it was some sort of magic trick or some fluke or something. But what I tried to explain to them was there was something going on here. It's very subtle, but I was building up a sense of this person's reality. And I went with it, but I didn't. It was very low key. So the last point: keep praise low key, if at all, and focus on the activity, not on the person. Yes, use yes to get no and no to get yes. So you can use a bit of reverse psychology. So yes, but. So what you're trying to do here is you're trying to give the person effectively grounds to show themselves as best as possible, without them feeling that they have to keep using these responses, which they built up over time. The books, which are very good and very informative, are available on Amazon and probably other online bookstores as well. There's Exposure